the thing about the M7 is that if you have the ability of really creating reverbs from spaces and listening to them, it makes it very easy to go in and actually create this. So a lot of the presets that you hear are captured not just out of, well, we made something to sound like that, although some are like that, but most are from real experiences. For example, many studios, for whatever reason, will send us their plates or their favorite rooms for us to incorporate into presets. And so you'll see a few of them are in there now. We've added a number of them since it's been out there a little while. We've gotten a lot of different people sending us just recordings of their rooms and saying, can you please make a preset for this, because we'd like to be able to offer this. I don't know, maybe they're planning to close the studio. The studio's closing. So I don't know exactly what the rationale is, but we've gotten a lot of that. So we've tried to incorporate some of those things.
Well, both of you guys have pursued a lot of real-world working conditions and tried to find presets that sort of solve these acoustic problems.
Yeah. I mean, you go back to the beginning, and one of the very first things that Brian and I did, and it sounds outrageous, but it's true. We have a friend, and he works with the Boston Symphony Orchestra in Symphony Hall in Boston, and he was remastering a lot of old 50s recordings. And the problem was that the noise floor in those recordings was very high. And as he reduced the noise floor using tools that are available today, he found that all the reverb tails were cut much too short. So here he is remastering these things, and all of these great performances and these reverb tails are just cut off. So what he did was he took and set up a nice pair of speakers out in Boston Symphony Hall and amped these orchestral recordings. And he captured the tail, and that was the way he was doing it. And he said, it'd be great if we had a reverb that could do this. He allowed us to sit there and play a lot of tracks, things that we were very familiar with. So we were listening to all of the usual suspects that you would listen to, and listening to what reverb sounds like in Boston Symphony Hall. And I knew just instinctively, and it was really made obvious, when you're listening in a great space, all of the textbook sorts of things that you hear about reverb just completely evaporate, because so much of it is just not true. So, for example, one of the great myths well, there's many, but one of them is that a room will, that the echo density in a room will just go to infinity, and it's equivalent to white noise. And I think that that's just a convenience thing, because most reverbs, synthetic reverbs, if you listen, the tails, a lot of times, you'll hear this with sibilants, for example, on a vocal. How many times have you had to de-es the reverb because you get this, the sibilants, and it just, well, there's your white noise. But that never happens in a real. It just doesn't happen.
Right.
Clearly, that going to white noise is, maybe true technically, but I think it's very overstated and not something that you want to try and duplicate in a reverb. And all of the Bricasti algorithms completely avoid that. There's also the very convenient myth of real rooms and how, the air, somehow magically makes things modulate, and that really in real performance spaces there's all this modulation, and there is some, it's true, but the amount of modulation that would be in these would be the equivalent of me really rapidly moving 50 feet towards the orchestra, and like I'd be on some type of carnival ride as I was listening to the orchestra. So not everything needs to be on some road to a Wurlitzer or something. It just doesn't really sound that way. You really have very stable images for most live performances. And V1 was really designed to capture that, so that algorithm was designed without the requirements for any type of modulation whatsoever. And as a result, it's very safe to put on pianos or other things. And it's another reason why you can get to sounds very quickly, because you don't have these artifacts. You don't have, one of my favorites that people often say is, can you blur it up a little bit? Because they're used to years of digital reverbs that made things sound very blurry. But if you
Muddy,
go back
sure.
to very classic sounds, when people say, oh, I want a classic reverb, I don't really think about the 80s reverbs as much, but I really think of chambers and plates and spaces, that those are the classic sounds, and that they don't have these artifacts of a lot of blurriness or and the blurriness is just caused because of traditionally the way algorithms were designed. It's just part of the design of almost every reverb algorithm, that as it recycles things, it tends to blur it up. Not only does the Bricasti not have the mechanisms that blur the sound over time, it actually will keep 30, 60 seconds of sound, thousands of instances of these, requires quite a bit of memory to do this, but it keeps just thousands of strings of sound that are 30 seconds to 60 seconds back in history, whereas almost every other reverb in existence, when you turn up a reverb to be 20 seconds long, you're really just recycling 1 second of sound in that sound. It was pointed out to me so well. I took it to a guy, and I had no idea that he was into chanting. But it was a hobby of his, and he actually had some. He told me they were bootleg recordings, because you're not allowed to record the monks, and and he said, but I really love getting those sounds. And so I said, well, let's try this. And not to say that chanting is ever going to be a real popular art form in the near term, but it was very interesting to see how, by maintaining that 30 seconds of history of these very long reverbs, he was for the first time able to get that the sound, those intermediate sounds that they can get in those natural spaces.